Last week we took a little break from this series, and I was out of town for most of the week last week, and so Casey filled in, and if you were here, Casey was sensational. He was, really, really, really good. And so if you missed it, you should watch it online. It was really good. But the gist of it was this. He talked about the promise from Philippians where Paul says, "And I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus." And Casey talked about how at times we all do things that cause us to question. Not so much that we're questioning God, but that we're questioning ourselves. That at times we can have something that just sort of pops out of us that we're like, whoa, what was that? What just happened? It's so dark, or it's just not who we want to be. And we can start to think like, if the Spirit of God is in me and is really at work in me, then how is it that can come out of me? Like, am I really a follower of Jesus? Am I really even a Christian at all? And Casey talked about how Peter wrestled with this after denying Christ, that he was essentially ready to be done. He said he was going to go back to fishing. But Jesus wasn't done with him. Jesus hadn't yet completed what he started. He hadn't given up on Peter, and so Jesus needed Peter to not give up on Peter. And I'm telling you, it was a powerful message. If you weren't here, you should watch it online. But I bring it up because I was sitting here, like in the chairs, and I'm not out there listening to other people preach that much. And so I'm sitting out there, and as I was sitting there, several things sort of hit me. One of the things that Casey and I have been talking about a lot as I've sort of been mentoring him as far as preaching goes is that we've talked about over the last year or so the importance of always applying the message to yourself first. Joey, is there a ringing? Can we turn down the bass or something? I feel like I've got a much more powerful voice than I actually have. Check, 1, 2. Yeah, take a little bit of the Check. That's a little better. There we go. A little less ringy. So Casey and I have been talking about preaching. Obviously, this is kind of a brand new thing for him in the last year. The last week was his 6th time preaching in the last year or so. And we talked a lot about what makes a good message and how do you put it together. And so we've talked a lot about always trying to apply whatever it is you're talking about to yourself first and think, what does this mean for me? Like, how do I need to respond to what I'm saying? How have I seen this thing played out in my life? And I've encouraged Casey, like whenever it's appropriate, to sort of share his life experience, to share how he's wrestled through something, whatever it is that he's talking about in his message. So last week, he did exactly that. And he shared something that kind of caught me off guard, because we didn't talk beforehand a lot. We talked about the general theme of the message, but he didn't tell me like exactly what was going to happen, and I trust him. That's okay with me. So he shared something that kind of caught me off guard. He was talking about how for years he had struggled with pornography. Now, people don't talk about that kind of stuff in church very often, and so I could feel the room sort of intensify a little bit. Some people perked up, and some people looked down, and other people were like, ee. And he went on to say that again, last week's message was his 6th, but before his 3rd time preaching at Brookview, he had given up pornography for a long time, but he had a little relapse right before his 3rd message. And so the guilt and the shame and questioning that came out of it, he almost like threw in the towel as far as the whole idea of preaching goes at all, or even heading towards ministry in his life. And he was kind of ready to say, because of what happened and what came out of him, he was ready to say, if this is in me, okay, if I'm capable of this kind of darkness, like, is my faith even real? Is God really doing anything in my life? And so he said he was about ready to call me when it happened and just say, hey man, I appreciate all the opportunities, but you have the wrong guy. Like, I had some good moments and it was fun, but God isn't actually changing me, and I'm the same old guy, and so I'm not your guy. I can't do this. And so he just about threw in the towel on the whole idea of preaching, ministry, going that direction with his life. Now, at the time, we did talk about what happened. We talked about the importance of him getting increasing accountability, of building guardrails into his life to protect him from temptation. And there are a lot of guardrails that we can build in. And he's done that. And I think all men need that. I think we do. I know I do. And so I knew about his relapse at the time that it happened, and I encouraged him not to give up. But when he came out and told all of you, and I'm sitting out there and I'm like, wow, I was caught off guard. And I have to admit, I was sitting here listening to it. My first thought was like, uh-oh, man. Like, I don't know that you want to go this public with that, because I don't know how people are going to react to that. So I was sitting there and I was a little uncomfortable. I was like, And then I started thinking, like, wait a minute. Like, what kind of a church are we? Like, do we really want leaders that have to feel like they have to pretend that they're holier than they are? Like, if he can preach with this kind of power, like, and this is the transparency that he's willing to use in this setting, like, he's setting the right kind of tone, okay? It's courageous. I was like, this is courageous. This is humble. This is exactly right. And so I'll tell you what I thought. I was sitting here and I was thinking, you know what? This guy is the real deal. God is doing amazing things in his life, and I know him very well. God is doing amazing things in his life, and if this is where he's at, like, you think about his preaching, if this is where he's at, like, at this stage, if he can preach with that kind of power, I can't wait to see where he is in 10 or 20 years. And so I am so unbelievably glad that he didn't throw in the towel. But then I thought about something else. I'm sitting here and I'm just wrestling through all this stuff. And I started thinking, you know, there are a lot of church contexts where Casey would have felt like, you know, you can't be that real about stuff in your life. Like, if I'm going to preach and I'm going to lead and I'm going to be up front, I have to hide this stuff and I have to pretend like I don't have these kinds of struggles. And so it just occurred to me that he was able to share that, and he was willing to share that because he knew who he was talking to. There is a safety in this particular little community. God has built this church on the idea that it's safe to be real with each other. And so I was sitting here last week. I was actually in the back row, and I was just so thankful for you guys, because I've been leading here for 11 years, and I have felt that the whole time. I am safe to be real. And that is rare, and it is special, and it's beautiful, and it's powerful. So, you know, thank you to you guys. And to Casey, I would just say, and he's not here this morning, but I would just say, Casey, I'm going to speak this into the camera. You are a stud. And I think that you are courageous and gifted. I think God is doing incredible things in you, and I think that we all see it. And I can't wait to see where it takes you and the people that you impact by it. And so, in Brookview, thank you for being a community of grace. It is absolutely a privilege to be able to serve you and serve here. And I'm incredibly thankful that this is where God has put me. So, that's it. All right, back to our topic for today. We're talking about anger, toxic stuff. Now, we get angry when we don't get what we want. Now, it's a very simple but very important idea, and so I'll say that again. Okay, anger is the result of not getting something that we want. Now, what we want might include what we deserve, because after all, who doesn't want what they think they deserve? And maybe this seems like sort of oversimplifying it, but think it over. I want you to just conjure up in your mind, recall a time when you were really angry. You might not have to go back that far. Maybe you have to go way back. But I want you to conjure up a very real, very tangible situation from your past and get it in your mind, okay? Is it possible, when you think about that you could reduce the entire situation to this? You wanted something, and you didn't get it. In other words, you didn't get what you were convinced you deserved. Or we might even say it this way: somebody owed you. Somebody owed you. Now, here's the thing. You show me an angry person, and I will show you a hurt person. The anger stems from feelings like these, like, you know, you took my reputation, or you stole my family, or you took the best years of my life, or you robbed me of my teenage years, or you robbed me of my purity, or you owe me a raise, you owe me a promotion, you owe me an opportunity, at the very least, you owe me respect, or you owe me affection. For all I've done, you owe me affection, or you owe me an apology. Now here's the point I'm trying to make. The root of anger is the perception that something has been taken, that something is owed you. And so now this debt-to-debtor relationship has been established. And it's easy to start believing that the only real remedy for it is somehow to get payback. Because, that's like how we settle a debt, right? But the irony is, in most cases, the perceived debt can actually never be paid. What do we want? You think about, for instance, how do you pay back your 25-year-old son for not being there for him when he was 12? How do you fix that? How do you pay that back? And we can wait around, for debts to be paid, just sit around waiting for debts to be paid that in reality can never be paid. And we can sort of retell ourselves the story over and over, and we can harbor anger, and we can feed it, and we can nurse it, and it can grow over time. And if enough anger and enough hurts start to get lodged in our hearts, we stop thinking like that person owes me, and we start thinking everybody owes me. You've all met people that were mad at you before they even met you. It's crazy. You bump into them somewhere you've never even met, you've never hurt them, but they're mad at you. This is what we could call the angry person. They're just angry all the time. And the closer you get to them, the more likely that their rage is somehow going to be turned and fixated on you. If you hang around long enough, you eventually will become the object. And so you think to yourself, what did I do? And the answer is that you stood in the way of something that they wanted. And maybe you say, no, no, I didn't. I didn't do anything. I didn't get in the way of anything. They're just mad. They're mad at everybody. They're mad all the time. I didn't do anything. And in that case, we're talking about a severe anger addict. Anger addicts have already decided that you won't get it right, and they won't even let you try because they can't let you get it right. Because if you got it right, then they'd lose their excuse to stay mad. And anger addicts love being mad. They like walking around believing that everybody owes them. Have you met people like this? Everybody owes them. Makes them feel self-righteous and superior, so they're mad. They're mad at other drivers. They're mad at the server at the restaurant. They're mad at the refs. They're mad at the neighbors. They're mad at their spouse. They're mad at their coworkers. They're mad at their boss. They're just mad. Now, maybe you're here and you know that what I just described is you. Your fuse is so quick. Your default disposition is anger. You don't trust people. You assume that everybody's out to get you. You feel like people don't respect you. They don't understand you. They don't get you. And for some reason, you always seem to feel alone. Now, here's what I'm going to guess. I'm going to guess that you've been hurt. That bitterness in you, it stems from somewhere. That you have a story and that your story is legit. Okay, you've been hurt. And maybe you're someone who's buried the story. You don't want to talk about it. Nobody knows about it. And if that's you, can I just suggest, maybe you need to tell your story to someone. Someone that you trust, someone that you know loves you. Or maybe you're exactly the opposite. You go around and you tell your story to everyone. You enjoy the sympathy. You can't tell your story often enough. And you've found that as you tell your story, people start to cut you slack. Once they know your story, then you assume they're going to tolerate all your junk. Because your story explains why you overreact, why you constantly say things you regret, why you lash out all the time. It accounts for your temper. It accounts for your moodiness. In all honesty, you feel like not only does your story explain your behavior, but you feel like your story justifies it. It's your built-in excuse for just being a jerk. It's your crutch, and you've leaned on it for years. And you assume because you have faced what you've faced, that you have every reason, every right to be the way you are. And so I'll just say, maybe that's true. Like, maybe you do have every right. But here's a question that every deeply angry person needs to consider. How long are you going to allow people that you don't even like, people that maybe aren't even still in your life, people that might not even still be alive, to control your life? I mean, why would you continue to give them that power? Here's the thing, we can walk around mad, and we can lash out and hurt people, and we can isolate ourselves, and we can make people scared of us, and we can ruin relationships, and we can sabotage opportunities to connect deeply, and the whole time convince ourselves that we have no choice but to act this way. We always have a choice. And I would say that in the same way that you've probably all known an anger addict, you've probably all also known somebody that is like unusually kind. Someone that navigates their world with a quiet confidence, a type of grace that's like profoundly magnetic. And maybe for a long time after you'd met this person, you just sort of assumed that they had like this glorious, easy life. Like they grew up in a family that was just a model of health. They were never mistreated by anybody, never had hard things along the way in their life. And then at some point down the road, you hear their story. And you think to yourself, oh my goodness. Like, how did a person that grew up in that environment or that's been through all of that, how did a person turn out like that? Like, how is it that they're so calm and they're so gracious and they're so thoughtful? Like, that's amazing. And I'll tell you how. It happens when a person quits using their story to justify their anger. When a person turns that story over to God and allows God to begin healing their heart. It's not that they bury their story. It's not that they can just forget about it. But their story becomes a whole lot less about their enemies, a whole lot less about what it is that's been taken from them, and more about the power of God in their life, about His love and His presence and His healing and His blessings. Because here's the deal. Anger alienates us from people. More times than we want to admit, like our shrapnel, it hits mostly the people that are close to us. Like they're innocent and they're clueless about why we just exploded on them. Our kids, our spouse, our friends, people that we love. And unfortunately, in most cases, it's the innocent, it's those closest to us that do all the paying when we're demanding that the debt be paid. And this is why God is so serious about us like ruthlessly eliminating anger, like killing it. Now listen to what Paul writes. This is Ephesians 4:31. He says, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Paul says we should get rid of anger. And the Greek word translated get rid of means to remove or to separate yourself from. Have you ever walked through a spider web? Like you're just walking along and you're having happy thoughts and and all of a sudden, whap! And it's like you got it on your face, it's in your eyelashes, it's in your hair, it's like, ah! When I was going to school up at Western, I worked at a golf course over the summers, for 5 summers, and I was a greenskeeper. And so I had to be up and start work before the sun comes up. And the house that I was living in that summer was this huge old place, and I lived there with 5 guys, and it was pretty sweet. But the walkway to where we parked our cars was lined with all of these trees. It's kind of a real narrow walkway, and it was just lined with all these old trees. And so I'd get up before dawn, and I'd shower, and I'd use my Irish Spring, and I was so happy, and I'm walking out to my car, I'm just happy to go work, and walking through the little gauntlet there, and just whap, 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 just spider web galore. Now, eventually, after doing that for like 2 months, I wised up, okay? And I started to walk the gauntlet like this, because it's dark, I can't see, it's first thing in the morning. And I would get hit in the morning and realize that I had parked my car there last night and I had just walked that gauntlet last night. And so it would occur to me like, all of these webs, they weren't here last night. which means they're fresh. And there's probably some like massive spider sitting in there in the dark that I couldn't see, and it's now crawling on my head. It's ready to go down my shirt. And so I'm just like, ah! And I'm telling you, like, I can't get it off fast enough. Just remove it. Be separated from it. Okay, now, this is the idea when you talk about Paul saying, I want you to be separate. I want you to get rid of it. This is the idea that Paul is communicating about anger. He says anytime we feel bitterness or rage or anger, anytime we feel any type of malice, like malice just means that we feel ill will towards somebody. We need to like separate from it. We need to get rid of it. Just like, I got to get this off of me. Now, when we think about our deep hurts, when we think about people that have wounded us, it's easy to read Paul's statement and go, is that even possible? And apparently, Paul thinks that it is. And before we write off Paul as someone that like lived in dreamland, a guy who doesn't really understand the real world where there's injustice and pain and hurt, we should know that he wrote the letter to the Ephesians from prison. Like he was unjustly thrown in prison because of his faith in Christ. He didn't write this from a beach in Tahiti. He wasn't sipping drinks with little umbrellas. He's like, hey, I got a good idea. Let's let go of all malice. He was an innocent man in chains. And when Paul tells us to let go of malice, he actually believes it's possible. He goes on, he says, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other. Paul says the remedy for anger is pretty simple. It's forgiveness. He says the only remedy for anger is forgiveness. So you think about it, you go, what is it that enables us to be kind and compassionate to those that have shown us neither kindness nor compassion? It's forgiveness. And Paul doesn't stop there. He frames the basis of our forgiveness this way. He says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. He says kindness and compassion are fueled by forgiveness, but not just like any type of forgiveness. He says it's a forgiveness that mirrors the forgiveness that we have all received from God. It's a just as type of forgiveness. Just as we've been forgiven, we forgive. And I think that for those of us that are Christ followers, we look at that and we would agree with this, okay, that's a good idea, like up to a point, right? And we start to wonder about limits. I mean, surely there are limits to forgiveness, right? I mean, what about people that don't deserve to be forgiven? What about people that never say they're sorry? What about people that don't change? How many times should we keep forgiving? I mean, at a certain point, don't we have the right to stay angry? At a certain point, isn't the right thing not to forgive? At a certain point, aren't we justified to not forgive? And this is exactly what the disciples thought when they listened to Jesus. And if you haven't noticed, Jesus was like really big on forgiveness. And one time he was teaching on it, and of course, he's pretty extreme about it. So here's what happened. This is Matthew 18, verse 21. It says, then Peter came to Jesus, like he was listening with everybody else, and he pulls him aside. He's like, says, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? In other words, Peter wants to know, when is enough enough? How many times do I have to forgive? And at what point does it become okay for me not to forgive? Jesus answered, I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. And before Peter has a chance to respond, Jesus illustrates with a parable. It goes right into a story. He looks at Peter and he says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold, that's a lot, 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay his debt. At this time, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him canceled the debt, and let him go. Now, Jesus does something very interesting with this parable. He puts the emotionally charged topic of forgiveness in different terms. Simply put, forgiveness is the decision to cancel a debt. Now, this is so simple and so practical, but it's so easily missed. As I mentioned earlier, whenever someone hurts you, there's a sense in which they've taken something from you. A debt is incurred. Like if somebody gossips about you, then they're stealing your reputation. If your employer fires you unjustly, they've taken your financial security. If your spouse is unfaithful to you, they've robbed you of your emotional security. Wherever there's a hurt, a debt is created. And now someone owes someone. And this is why we say things like, okay, I'm going to get even. I'm going to get payback. Because in order for justice to be served, a transaction has to take place. Something must be transferred back to the victim. Could be an apology, it could be a favor, it could be money, it could be some other form of restitution, but tension will always remain for us until the debt is settled. Now, in the parable of Jesus, this debt would be settled in the ancient way. The master would sell the servant's wife and his children and all of his possessions. Something that he had every right to do under ancient law. So the servant did the only thing he could. He pleaded for mercy. He promised to pay back the debt. Unfortunately, he owed more than he could ever repay, more than he could ever make in his lifetime. Now, thankfully, his master was a merciful man. His master took pity on him and canceled his debt. He opted to forgo his right to be paid back. That's the essence of forgiveness. Okay? It's a decision to cancel a debt. And Jesus continued. He said, but when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. That's not a lot. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. Okay, now, we find the servant in the same position his master was just in. His buddy owes him a small little debt, an amount that given time he could easily pay back. And we'd expect a guy just forgiven this massive debt to extend grace to his friend. But that's not what he does. Verse 30. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. So this guy is thrown in prison until his family can go work this thing off and pay his debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, because what happened to the first guy is legendary by now, when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt. Okay, again, this is Jesus' definition of forgiveness, to cancel a debt. I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? To which I'm sure every one of Jesus' listeners, as he's telling this story to make a point, would have nodded and thought like, well, yeah, of course he should have had mercy on his fellow servant. I mean, anybody can see that, Jesus. In his anger, his master handed him over to the jailers until he should pay back all that he owed. Now, if Peter is sitting there going, nice story, Jesus, but like, what's this got to do with my original question? It was about to become painfully clear because Jesus concludes, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Like if the meaning of the parable hasn't been clear, it's clear now. The king in the parable represents God. The servant who had his debts forgiven represents you and me. Any one of us that's had our sins forgiven by God. And the second servant is then anybody that we hold anything against. And these are the people that have offended us. These are the people that have hurt us. These are the people that have embarrassed us, people that have abandoned us or rejected us. These are the people who owe us. People we have a legitimate case against. And Jesus' words couldn't be any clearer. Cancel their debt. Forgive them or else. And I have to be honest here. When Jesus says, this is how my Father will treat each of you, I really don't know with certainty what he's referring to. Okay, but obviously it's not good. I mean, clearly this is a stern warning. But let me just summarize something that deep down I think we all know is true. If we hold out waiting to be paid back for the wrongs done to us, we will be the ones who pay. On the other hand, if we cancel the debts that are owed to us, we will be set free. There may not be a literal prison for those that harbor resentment, but clinging to the debts owed to us puts us into a prison of sorts. If we demand repayment, then in the end, we will pay. And I think that we've all known people that have unresolved anger. And many of you are actually the victims of somebody else's unresolved anger. And for some of you, like this is the root of your own. I mean, unresolved anger has this multi-generational implications. And if your experience with angry people is real, then you know that Jesus' warning isn't exaggerated, because anger destroys people. Like we think we have a right to it, as if it's something to be prized. Okay, but your pain isn't a trophy to show off. It's not a story to tell. It's poison to your soul. And to refuse to forgive is to choose to self-destruct. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that if you forgive, you have to re-engage in the relationship. Okay, forgiving and trusting are not the same thing. Like if you get hurt by someone, you lose trust, and that's natural. And you can forgive someone without having to trust them again. Like you can cancel their debt, but that doesn't mean that you have to go back into business with them. You see what I'm saying? Like if a woman is beaten by a man, she can forgive him, she can cancel his debt, she can let go of her anger. That doesn't mean that she has to move back in. Like if a friend betrays your confidence, starts gossiping about you or divulging things about you that you never intended to be divulged, you can cancel the debt, you can let go of anger, but it might be wise to quit telling her your innermost secrets. If a business partner poses you and you're deeply wounded by it, like you can forgive and you can cancel the debt and you can let go of anger, that doesn't mean that you have to go back into business together. Forgiveness and trust are two very separate things. You can forgive even if the other person never changes. You can forgive even if they never acknowledge or apologize. Because forgiveness isn't about them, it's about you. Now, trusting, that is about them. If there's no reconciliation and there's no confession or repentance, no sense that things are going to be different in the future, then Jesus is absolutely not commanding us to go trust the untrustworthy. Do you see what I'm saying? But to harbor anger and bitterness, to dream of horrible things happening to the other person, to continue to have imaginary conversations where you destroy them, to feel the rage well up in you every time you get images of their face or you hear their name. Okay, that's not good. And Jesus wants us to separate from it. Why? Because to refuse to forgive is to eventually self-destruct. And we cling to our anger because we feel like we deserve it, like it's our right. And in the shadow of my hurt, the decision to forgive feels like I'm somehow rewarding my enemy. But when I put this in perspective, when I think of it in light of the cross, then in the shadow of the cross, forgiveness is simply a gift from one undeserving soul to another. It's a gift that ensures my freedom from my own prison of anger. See, when I accept forgiveness from God, I'm set free from the penalty of my sin. But when I extend grace to someone that's hurt me, there's a sense in which I'm free from his or her sin as well. And this morning, I just want to close by getting real personal. And I want to invite you to think about somebody that's hurt you. And maybe it's a family member or somebody that used to be a trusted friend. Maybe it's your ex. Could be a parent or an old coworker. Could be a coach or an old boss. But here's what I want to invite you to do. You know what the person did. But I want you to think about what they took. What did they take from you? Did they take your confidence? Did they take your time, your money? Did they take your innocence? Did they take away an opportunity? I want you to think about what it is that they took. And then I want you to think about what it is that you feel like they owe you. What do they owe you? Do they owe you an apology? Do they owe you a marriage? Do they owe you a family, a reputation, a promotion? Do they owe you an entire chapter of your life? What do they owe you? And then I want to invite you to do one of the most difficult things. And just cancel the debt. After you figure out what it is that they took and what you feel like they owe, I want to invite you to just cancel the debt and let it go. Figure out your full case and then just dismiss it. And many of you are probably very aware that on your chair there's a little piece of paper like this. And I want to invite you to write down for yourself who this is and what they've done. So, Heavenly Father, and you put their name in there, has taken whatever it is that they've taken from you. I've held on to this debt long enough. I choose to cancel this debt. This person doesn't owe me anymore. Just as you forgave me, I forgive whoever it is. I encourage you to write that down. And then you notice that there's matches on your chair. And here's what I thought would be epically awesome at Brookview, is if we had a huge bonfire in here. And we took these contracts and we forgave these debts, and then we just this huge fire, and we'd be worshiping, and Matt and Christy would be leading, and hands would be raised, and tears would be flowing. People come up here, and there would be just this huge fire. But if we did that, I think the sprinklers would come on, and they'd get mixed with the electricity, and people would start getting shocked to death, and so that isn't going to work. So what we did instead is we gave you matches. And the idea is you can take this home with you, and in a place that's appropriate and in a place that's meaningful to you, you can burn this thing. And here's what I would ask. Please don't go out into the parking lot after church and burn it and drop it in the parking lot out there to make a mess for Linwood High School and for Dale and for all of that, okay? But you can take it with you. You can think about it. You can pray. Think about all that God has forgiven you, and then release the debt of someone else. And then one last thing. You might be wondering, okay, so should I tell the person that I've forgiven them? And I just want to say, probably not. Probably not. Because in many cases, doing that just opens up a whole new can of worms and issues. Because maybe they don't feel like they ever wronged you in the first place. And you sharing your decision will just feel like an accusation, and it will create whole new levels of conflict that you don't want to be in. The one time that it's always appropriate is when someone asks you for forgiveness, okay, or comes to you to apologize for something that went on in the past. Other than that, okay, this transaction, this is between you and God.